if you're researching the efficacy of organizations and men's work, what are some of the factors that are most important in actually producing change in a place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know that we have the answers to that, but I think that the answer is the work at multiple levels, because the work that goes on is attempts to impact individuals, it attempts to impact smaller communities, and there's even an organization for more cultural or broader social change. And so a lot of the campaigns or the kinds of work that are being oriented towards men start, I think, at the first with the idea that men should renounce or give up their own violence and collusion if they're actively engaged in that. The second kind of level of important intervention is to have men work to change, to not be passive bystanders or collude through their silence with other men's actions, but to speak out actively against them and reach out to other men to try to change that. And I think that on the broader, so there's the individual change, there's the work to change or become part of a network in their immediate lives of changing other men or reaching out to other men. And then there's that broader social impact, which can come through organizational levels. There's men involved in work in changing their organizational response to victimization that women experience within their workplaces. There's efforts to create public education campaigns where men are very visible and speaking out in support of women's rights, or speaking out against men, directly against men's violence or abuse against women. So I think it's that multi-level effort that's really important to keep in mind, and not single out one single place where the work should be located.
If I can just jump in here very quickly to make a comment.
Please.
Is that I think we also need to be very careful here that we don't only locate violence within South Asia or Afghanistan or India, as in these examples we are talking about, that there's a kind of masculinity that operates in North America too, and there are universal structures that you can map in these both places in the way masculinity gets defined or the power of masculinity gets defined. And the other thing, I think this is sometimes harder for men to participate from some of the reasons that Richard and Ali both articulated quite well. Let me just add one more, and that has to do with this with this position of being a dominant player, sort of men in patriarchy, men usually in powerful roles. So part of being in a powerful role is their own power is invisible to them. And how do you make that power invisible? First, really has to do with understanding that women have voices, women have agencies, women to be able to pay attention to the fact that because men are in power, women are in invisible positions, and men can take advantage of that. So how do you remain powerful is one question, and yet continue to be sympathetic and listen, and in some way sort of point to your own power, your own complicity, your own collusion in your own patriarchy. And
well,
so
what do you think?
and I think that's hard to do, but there are models that we have known, because I think gender is one way to do it, but you can also use in the way we understand race. So for a long time, for example, we didn't think of white people as having race. They were the invisible, dominant, powerful category. But in the 90s, you had something called as whiteness studies, which basically moved away, because prior to that, we only talked about race as being the Hispanics and African Americans having race. But the dialogue changed considerably when you pointed out that, look, everybody has race. And once you locate race across these groups, the whole dynamic changes. So I think we can think about this in intersecting categories, that those who occupy these gender positions also have race and class. And depending on where they're from, I think the conversation changes. So in my experience in Delhi, there were a large number of middle-class educated men who were part of this public dialogue and much more willing to cross these so-called positions to engage in this dialogue and talk about their own collusion. In that sense, I agree with Ali that this movement has not spread outside. There are many, many parts of India or even South Asia where this is not recognized, or even there is no space to talk about your own complicity. Because talking about your own complicity in some ways is making yourself vulnerable in front of other men.
In the places where it is happening in an exciting way, why is it? Why has that process happened around Delhi and in India? Is it? I mean, the catalyst presumably go a while back.
Yes, I think this particular moment has also happened because this is no longer being talked about only in terms of gender rights. This is being talked about in terms of human rights as well. There are a number of different factors that have come together in this case. One has to do essentially with the fact that the newspapers, if you pick up any newspaper, Times of India, Hindustan Times, they have been reporting on the sidelines about rape cases pretty much every other day, but they've not gotten the attention in the way because of the brutality of this very particular incident, but also in the way it has galvanized the whole nation across different classes. So you had actually the Prime Minister of India talk about this. This was unheard of. You had major actors sending their messages through Twitter. You had feminist organizations trying to educate men about this. You had editorials. And this was in the media too, because people were paying attention at this point. So there was a certain vulnerability of, I would say, kind of a perfect storm, where you had media presence, where you had women were able to push this forward. They've been working on these issues for many, many years, many feminist organizations. And this story somehow could not be made invisible.
We had a question from a listener who wanted to know more about your sister and how she's doing now. Do you want to tell briefly, as much as you feel comfortable telling the story of your sister's story and how it affected you, but also how she is doing, what her future looks like?
Thank you. My sister is now with us. She lives with us in Kabul. She was a victim of abusive marriage in Iran, and while they were far from us, we had no knowledge of what was going on with her. And till finally we could get to know that she is being a victim of an abusive marriage. And as soon as we learned about it, we started taking action, and we started helping her. And we were very sensitive to the issue of hearing that my sister is being tortured and being beaten very severely by her husband. Although she never tried to report that to us, since she was raised in a family where domestic violence and beating women was pretty normal, and she seemed that normal as well, and she never tried to reach out to us so that we could help her. And but finally, we learned about her through our relatives in Iran, and then we started taking action to rescue her. As soon as I started helping my sister, since I was very sensitive to the issue, we faced a lot of criticism, a lot of challenges, both by our relatives, by the lawmakers, and it really made it very hard for us to advocate for my sister. But I couldn't really just leave it and don't help my sister. And I started looking for more ways and solutions in order to be able to help my sister. So I searched more and studied more about women's rights, studied about women's rights in Islamic frame, and in order to be able to help my sister. And the more I searched for it, and the more I studied about women's rights, the more I empowered myself, the more I became passionate about women's rights. I saw more women, I saw more victims of domestic violence and victims of different forms of violence in Afghanistan and around the world that really made me sensitive to the issue. And then I made a commitment to advocate for my sister and to, as well as other women.
We have a question on the World Facebook page saying, from Kathleen McGee, saying, in the news coverage of the protests in India, I was surprised to see men standing up with women in the protests, but not in Egypt and not in the United States. Why is this? Why the reluctance? And that sounds like a good question for Richard. I mean, you were, and Sunil, you were noting that, you know, these structures are everywhere, but what do you notice about where men and women are doing this work together and where it's separate or where the men are invisible?
Yeah. Well, I think there's compelling examples globally of places where men and women are working closely together and where men are finding visibility. Certainly there are many places in the United States where that does occur, and almost every region in the world we have examples of really compelling work that's being done by men. Most often, the majority of organizations that we interviewed report that they work in collaboration, at least they report working in collaboration with women's organizations. And I think that's a really important element of this work, that men not head off on their own or seek to make this kind of change independently. That could reinforce some of the things Sunil was talking about the way men use their power or could abuse their privilege and power as men. It's important for that work to happen side by side with women. So I guess I'm thinking that there are many instances where those kinds of visible actions occur.
We should actually wrap up already. We always only scratch the surface in these things. I know we could go on talking for hours. Any last comments from out there? Please tweet them at #WorldGender.
Just one comment. I think it's also helpful to talk about the threat of violence. There's violence, but there's also the threat of violence which is in the public space. So when women walk around, say in Delhi, they have to take the bus. The way they have to regulate themselves, where they can go, that itself has deep psychological effects all over globally, including in the United States too. But in public spaces, in cities such as India, where gender can be visible, in what spaces, that has a tremendous consequence in how it shapes women's behavior, their attitudes, whether they can go to school, whether they can take the train, do they need somebody to escort them, and so on. And unless we find a way to neutralize those spaces and find a way to talk about and give women the same power as men have, I think the conversation is sort of incomplete.
I just wanted to, again, just say to Sunil and Ali that their examples are just so inspiring of men taking this kind of action and facing off, as Ali was describing, against dominant forms of masculinity that tend to silence men or make them fearful of being involved in this kind of change. But as Ali so, vividly described in his own life, I think many men in their hearts don't support this kind of violence. They don't want to be part of it, and given the chance to work together, they can raise their voices to oppose it. And so I just want to thank them for their examples, which I think are can inspire men around the world to try to take these kinds of actions. And I just hope that we find ways to work together, learn from each other's work, support each other's work, and find ways to make this kind of global movement of men grow to be a stronger force in ending this kind of violence.
I echo what you said, Richard. You said it very nicely and eloquently. Well
said. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you for that description, Ali. That's Ali Shahidi from Kabul in Afghanistan, Richard Tolman, professor of social work at the University of Michigan, Sunil Bhatia, media scholar at Connecticut College, and again, my name's Jeb Sharp. I'm the show producer at PRI's The World public radio program about global politics and culture and all of this. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jeb. And thank you, Anjali, for the invitation. And thank you to Ali and Richard for their very insightful thoughts.
Thanks. Same.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great to do it.